This is Hellslave, which is a dungeon crawler that's kind of hard to explain a little bit. It's sort of like if something like Darkest Dungeon and Etrian Odyssey had a really twisted baby, because it uses a sort of Darkest Dungeon-like oppressive dark fantasy art style, and these hub towns that you can visit to upgrade your equipment and sell your gear and all that stuff, but it also uses a combat system that is first person, like head-on to the enemies, like a classic sort of first-person dungeon crawler, and the actual dungeon exploration is done in a completely different way with these sort of, they almost look like Dungeons and Dragons play maps a little bit. They're like these hand-drawn, top-down 2D maps. It's really a really nicely presented game, and I think that a huge amount of effort has gone into the presentation style of this game with its really nice, very dark, grungy, dark fantasy art style, but also with some really excellent music that adds a lot of atmosphere to the game. The way the towns look all sort of downtrodden, and the way the whole world looks just very hollow and sinister, the way the dungeon maps actually work, and the fact that pretty much every part of the dungeon maps that you can interact with has its own hand-drawn little portrait and stuff. Even stuff like lootable corpses and lootable containers have their own hand-drawn bits that you can see. There's just a ton of work that's been put into the overall art style of this game, and I have a lot of respect for whoever's actually drawing all of this art, because it all looks really good, and there are even actual cutscenes that are done in like a graphic novel panel by panel style that have this same art style going through them. So yeah, the whole game from start to finish has really nice overall presentation, and it lends itself a lot of atmosphere. The overall atmosphere of the game is very dark, dingy, oppressive, kind of spooky. And the idea is that horrible demons have invaded this world and started murdering everything, and it's your job to stop them. Now, normal humans, mortals, can't really do much against this horde of demons, so you actually sell your soul to one of them, and you can actually choose one of 5 in the beginning of the game at character creation, which are basically like classes. It's how the game kind of determines your class. And you are a sort of demon-human hybrid, and you go around and actually try and stick it to all of them and save humanity. And after you've created your character, and by the way, I really like how your character sort of paper doll, like your character portrait in your inventory menu, actually reflects all of the stuff you have equipped. That's another good part of this game's presentation style. All of the stuff from like your shirt and pants and various bits of armor and weaponry and all that stuff, it all actually shows up on your character portrait, which is a nice touch. There are also a whole bunch of equipment slots, by the way, from multiple ring slots, amulet slots, weapon slots, offhand slots, all the various equipment bits that you would think of for main armor pieces and all that. It's all here, so you do have quite a bit of control over what your character is wearing at any given time, and that means there's a lot of loot in this game. A whole bunch of loot from weapons and armor pieces and other trinkets and key items and crafting ingredients and all sorts of stuff like that. And you will venture into one of the game's various towns and start just talking around. You can click on various bits of the town to interact with them, from buildings where you can do business, buy potions, buy equipment, and things of that nature, and also various NPCs that will give you the main quest line of the game as well as different side quests. There are a limited number of side quests in the game, and they're actually pretty handy to do because they can give you some extra kind of neat stuff that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like special potions that give you permanent upgrades and things like that. But the main quest line will lead you all around the various bits of the sort of world map that you can travel around on. And all of the interactable areas are their own self-contained dungeons that are also quite sprawling on the inside, and this is where the main meat of the gameplay actually lies. These 2D dungeon maps have a whole bunch of different nodes represented by these little white circles that you can explore, and you simply right-click around to walk around the map, and you have this sort of threat level indicator on the right side of the screen, and as you're walking around, this will get more and more red until eventually you encounter what's sort of like a random battle in a JRPG, only it's not quite so random because you actually have an indication of when it's getting close to happening. And in between these battles, you'll be exploring around this very nicely drawn 2D map and going to these various nodes. Each one has its own hand-drawn scene that will play out as you interact with the environment, and there'll be all sorts of different interactions. You can search the environment, which will give you a chance to maybe find some loot or find an enemy. It kind of depends on your luck. You may find some pots to smash or a corpse to push over and loot or something like that. And also occasionally when you find stuff to loot, instead of smashing it, it will be trapped and it'll explode. And when this happens, you have a limited time to click 3 different red sort of targets around the scene, and if you're able to click them all in time, you avoid the damage, and you'll also get an experience boost, a 15% experience boost that lasts for the entire dungeon, which is really nice, and these actually stack. So if you find, like 5 or 6 of these trap things, you can eventually get like a 60%, 75% boost to the whole experience that you're earning throughout the dungeon. There are also some puzzles and things you can find, like lightable torches that you have to light in a certain order, or certain keys that you have to find from various like mini-boss enemies to unlock certain extra parts of the dungeon, and some things like that. So these dungeons are actually pretty involved. They might look a little bit simple at first because it's just like a flat 2D map, but I think that this adds a lot of atmosphere. I think it's a really nice way to present these dungeons, and they're actually quite expansive when it comes down to all the fights you're going to have to do, all the various nodes that you can explore, and all the different puzzles that you can find. There's actually quite a bit to do in each of these dungeons, and each one will take you a pretty good amount of time to go through. But, of course, now we get to the combat, because combat is sort of the main part of this game. This is what you'll be doing most of the time, and as I mentioned, it is a sort of turn-based tactical affair that is front-on, like first-person. And as you can see down there in the bottom middle of the screen, you have quite an expansive hotbar, which is a pretty nice feature because it's really easy to mess around with. You can get all sorts of active abilities that go on this bar, and as well as having some other abilities and things like usable items like potions and stuff that you can find, and all you have to do is just drag and drop onto this bar. You can rearrange it however you want, which is a really nice little feature because there's actually a lot of activatable abilities in this game. There's a lot of skills you can get, so it's nice to have such an expansive customizable bar. And the way that the turns happen is actually not exactly turn by turn, but instead it's measured in seconds. And at the very top of the screen in battle, you can see this gauge that represents different increments of seconds, and all of your various attacks and spells and things take a certain number of seconds. And you can look up there, and all you have to do is hover over one of the buttons to one of your attacks, and it will show you where you'll end up, where your next turn will end up after you cast it, which is a really nice feature. And so everything that you do and everything that the enemies do is based on this number of seconds bar, and there are even some instant actions which take pretty much no time at all that only advance you like a quarter of a segment forward and allow you to do a whole bunch of stuff very quickly. So it's nice to be able to see exactly how far you'll end up and things like that, and it makes the combat feel relatively tactical because you can actually see the exact delay of everything that you do and sort of plan ahead each number of seconds as to what you should be doing. Now, I mentioned a ton of abilities and stuff, and that's because every time you level up, you get one active and one passive point, and this game has quite a large skill tree for each. It's actually very expansive. The active and the passive skill trees are each very large, and you gain in power quite quickly because of this, and you also start in sort of like the middle bottom of each of them, which is kind of unusual for how skill trees work. They're arranged sort of like an irregular grid, and you just sort of explore around them as you go. This means that the game has actually quite a lot of build variety because there's your magic attacks and your physical attacks, there's building up mana, and there's building up rage, and there's all sorts of various attacks and passives that are related to each of these different resources and how you use them. So for me, I chose Leviathan to worship from the beginning. He's basically the mage class, and I did a whole bunch of magic and mana related stuff. So I have all kinds of extra things like mana drain from attacks and high magical crit chance, as well as all sorts of different spells, some that are defensive and allow me to dodge attacks or deflect the next couple of attacks that come at me, or things that heavily weaken an enemy towards like a big crit that comes afterwards, and some other things like that. So there's actually quite a bit of synergy to all the various abilities, and it means that the build variety is quite nice in this game, especially when you combine all of these various active and passive skills with all of the different equipment slots that you have. And equipment does have a colored rarity system, and there's a lot of it. And the loot system is pretty well done in my opinion, because it tends to not have as much of the kind of boring plus 1% crit chance stuff, and more of the kind of exciting things that add all sorts of other synergistic abilities to your build and things, just stuff that makes it a little bit more exciting, stuff that's not quite so basic, and I do appreciate having a lot of loot that has more interesting characteristics to it. There are also a couple of other mechanics to the combat system that make it kind of neat. There's one mechanic where every 20 seconds of combat, time will freeze for a second, and you have a list of abilities that are specific to this mechanic that you can put on this diamond-shaped toolbar. And you can use each of these once per battle, and then they sort of burn out until the next battle. And these range from things like making your next attack life leech a whole bunch based on how much damage it does, or making you automatically dodge the next hit that comes for you, and some things like that. They're just nice little boosts to how you fight in general, and they add a little bit of extra color to the combat. There's also the stance system, which you'll unlock at a certain point, where there are different stances that you can switch between that have various benefits, like, increasing your magical crit chance based on how much mana you have, or automatically deflecting 10% of the melee physical damage you take, and things of that nature. So different stances based on, again, accentuating build variety. And there's also this really neat thing the game doesn't really tell you about at all, called a Goetia scroll. And the way that it works is it stores up a number of charges, one charge for every enemy you kill, and it can have up to 10 charges. You can consume 2 charges to generate a syllable, a sort of evil word, or a part of an evil word, and you can store up to 5 syllables at once. you can just click on the syllable that you have stored and it will do whatever it is that syllable does, and it'll act as an instant action, just barely advancing time. So these are nice ways to help give you a little bit of an advantage during combat. So things like making your next attack a guaranteed crit, or restoring some of your mana based on the number of enemies present, or making all enemies have 50% chance to miss for the next 20 seconds, and things of that nature. These are really nice sort of bonuses that you can store up and use on more difficult fights. And there's actually one mechanic to this that the game doesn't explain at all, and it's kind of like, do you remember rune words from Diablo 2? Where if you put runes in a specific form, it'll actually give you an extra bonus that's not just related to what the runes themselves do on their own. This is kind of like that. If you click certain syllables in a certain order, it'll actually form a Goetic word, a phrase, and this will give you an extra bonus effect that is unique to that phrase, and it has nothing to do with what the individual syllables on their own did. So if you can remember these phrases, because the game does not note them down, you have to memorize them yourself, you can get some really powerful effects during battle. So overall, this means that there's a lot to do during battle. There's a lot you can do. There's a tremendous number of abilities and various synergistic effects. There's the scroll, there's the stances, and all kinds of things. So overall, the combat is relatively complex, although it takes a while to get there. It starts off very, very simple and quite basic, and it takes several levels before you start to unlock these various mechanics and actually make the combat a bit more colorful. Overall, I think it's actually a pretty solid game. I think it's got a really neat presentation style that is very cohesive. It's very dark fantasy in a really fun way, a very nice atmospheric way, and it's also quite mechanically complex in a way that makes it really fun to play. I like the dungeon exploration, I like the questing, I like the combat. However, I do have some problems with it. For one, the user interface for this game is a little bit messy and kind of inconsistent at times. It's very grid happy. Both of the skill trees are big grids, your inventory is one giant grid, the trade menu is a big grid. Everything is very grid based, and it's honestly kind of hard to navigate at times because it's just one huge solid wall of stuff, just a big wall of information, and it makes equipping stuff and going through the various trader menus and things to be a little bit unnecessarily difficult, I would say, because it's just such a big mass of things all in your face on one big screen, and without having like very many sorting options or tabbing or listing or anything, it makes all of the menus just a little bit more of a pain to navigate than they necessarily need to be, and this is compounded by the fact that, as I said, they can be a bit inconsistent. In some menus you have to left click something to do a thing, in some menus you have to right click something, some of them you have to double left click something. It's a little bit inconsistent as to what control does what on what menu, and it just sort of adds up to make some of the user interface a little bit less friendly than perhaps it could be. The game also doesn't like to tell you what to do, and I think there's something to be said about games that don't explain all of their mechanics and don't over-tutorialize everything and allow the player to explore and learn things on their own. I tend to like that sort of thing, but there is a fine line between not over-tutorializing and not telling the players important information that they need and frustrating them. And I think that although this game for the most part does the former, sometimes it does a little bit of the latter, and some areas are a little bit difficult to understand what you're supposed to be doing because it's not very clearly marked. Like the fortress level, for instance, where you have to fight two bosses to get two keys, but it's not clear at all where these bosses are. They're not interactable nodes like literally everything else has been up to that point, and instead they're just empty looking rooms that you have to walk into, but you have to walk into a certain amount to kind of a specific point that's very precise to actually get the boss to appear and fight you, and there is no indication that this is the case. And it's just little things like that that make some of the navigation in this game a little bit unfriendly, I think, because it really just doesn't always like to tell you what you need to be doing, and at times it can get a little bit confusing because, like I said, because of this inconsistency, some stuff is not very clearly marked and it's not always exactly clear what you should be doing at that time. I've also found the game to be very easy so far, although that's not necessarily a complaint or anything, it's just an observation. I think it is quite an easy game, probably because there's so many various powerful actives and passives that you can get very quickly. You amass power very fast, and the enemy variety is not amazing in this game, by which I mean there's a fair number of different enemies, which is nice, and they all have really nice artwork, but they don't do a lot of different things. Most of the enemies in this game are just a case of you attack them until they die. There's not a whole lot more strategy to it than that that's really required. There's a lot of possible strategy that you could employ, but you don't really even need to most of the time because the enemies are relatively simple. They'll just hit you. You know, there are some more elite and boss enemies that have a little bit more complexity to them, especially the big chapter bosses, which are actually quite fun in my opinion. They have various things they can afflict you with, various status effects and stuff, and things that make strategy a lot more important in those fights, and that's where the game really shines in my opinion. And it would be nice if more of the combat was a little bit more involved like that, because it gives you a lot of tactical choice, but it also gives you such easy fights that you don't really have to use that tactical choice, if you know what I mean. It's mostly just a case of do burst damage until they die and then move on. So I do think the game is quite easy because of that, and because of the enemy variety not having a whole lot of enemies with powerful synergistic effects or fun status effects or other things they can do aside from just do direct damage to you. It means that until you get to some of the bigger boss fights, the combat is quite easy. However, I will also say that the developer has expressed a lot of interest in the negative and critical reviews of this game, and has been very perceptive in understanding the problems that people have had, and has made it very clear that they plan to continue working on this game and refining it and hammering out the issues and stuff like that. So all of these things I'm saying are because the developer has taken a very clear interest in actually fixing these things, and has made it clear that they are aware this is not the most perfect product ever and does have its problems, and they are open to actually fixing those problems. So yeah, that's a very good thing to see, and I'm excited for what could be done with this game, because I think it's on the precipice of great as far as it being a unique take on a dungeon crawler. It's good, and some of its sort of interface and inconsistency problems and difficulty problems kind of prevent it from being truly great. So I think after some updates and after a bit of shoring up of some of these things, it could be a really fun time. So that is Hellslave. I will link you below to the Steam store page in the description below this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.